Hello and welcome again to Sport Unlocked, the podcast giving you a comprehensive overview and analysis of the week's big sports news issues. Coming up, F1 rulemaking is under fire over the controversial season finale. I've been speaking to the new world champion, Max Verstappen. In European football, vaccination disparities are becoming clearer and the Premier League is in a mess over pandemic postponements. Just what should happen next? There's also been a debacle with the Champions League draw. We'll hear what went wrong from the UEFA president Aleksander Ceferin and what they're doing about it. Then there's news of how FIFA is changing the sale of commercial rights for the women's game, and we'll explore LaLiga's bumper new TV rights deals. Then there's news of the new policies coming for transgender swimmers. As ever, if you're enjoying the pod, please hit subscribe so Sport Unlocked lands in your pod feed automatically. And you can always send us feedback at Sport Unlocked on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. I'm Rob Harris from the Associated Press, and alongside me as ever, Martyn Ziegler from the Times and Tariq Panja from the New York Times. Unfortunately, we are all virtual because Omicron has put paid to our plans to be together in person this week. Chris Whitty, the UK's chief scientific advisor, telling everyone to prioritise their social contact. But let's not take how we are recording a decision on how we prioritise our friendship between us.
It was a shame that our plans to have coffee and toast and marmalade in a leading London hotel and doorstepping the Premier League meeting were kiboshed by the latest outgoings. Everything became virtual. So, we're having to do this virtually as well. But there's been a hectic week, isn't it? Starting off with Formula One, which is, I think, I'm not the greatest Formula One fan, but when I saw what was going on, I just thought, really, is this really happening? What was your take, guys?
Well, there's a lot of people saying the way Max Verstappen won the title, denying Lewis Hamilton a record 8th F1 title on the final lap, with the confusion that we'll get into over the lapping and tyre changes and the ability of Verstappen to overlap. Many saying that's damaging for the sport and the controversy will turn off new fans who had switched on. I'm thinking actually a lot of sort of general sports fans switching on might have actually revelled in the drama and the controversy for not only during the race, but the hours and days afterwards. A bit of sort of to and fro between the teams and bit of sort of edge who would win the title. A bit like F1's version of hanging chads from 2000 and the US election.
Yeah, well, it got a long tail. It's almost a full week of extra coverage, and that's probably valuable. But like Ziegs, I'm a recent returnee perhaps to Formula One. Used to watch it in the days of Senna and our Nigel, but thanks to the Netflix documentary, sort of got back into it, like millions of new people, new viewers, and again was left with a very strange feeling at the end of that race. You sat on the couch watching this for a number of hours, and then suddenly the race is turned on its head by a chap sat in a control booth. The thing is, it's one of those controversies that should be straightforward and isn't. A sport needs to have a set of rules that everyone understands, and if the people who are zing around a racetrack at however many miles an hour, risking their lives, don't know, and the people in the control rooms haven't got a clue, I'm not sure what we were watching.
This is how it did unfold during the race to perhaps a larger audience than expected, getting an insight you wouldn't get, say, in football from the referees during a game.
Michael, this isn't right.
Go ahead, Toto.
You need to reinstate the lap before. That's not right.
Toto?
Yes.
It's called a motor race, okay?
Sorry?
We went to car racing.
So that was Toto Wolff, the Mercedes team boss, and Michael Massey, the F1 race director.
Yeah, so my take from this, when I was watching things coming up to that final lap, I thought, well, if this is what has been decided is going to happen, then the outcome they want is for Verstappen to win the race and to become world champion, and there to be a massive controversy which everyone gets everybody talking, and that's exactly what happened. So I think Formula One are sort of rubbing their hands with glee, thinking, "Oh, this is great. We got a new world champion. Everyone's excited about it." But to me, it was just like, it just seems so contrived. But maybe people don't care.
Yeah, perhaps. Also, you've got to think they might want that, but their big ticket guy for all these years has been Lewis Hamilton, and the idea that you're going to have a contrived finish just to get a new champion, and if that is the case, it's completely disrespectful to this guy Lewis Hamilton, who's carried the series on his shoulders for so long. The other thing I noticed, and guys, would it be the equivalent of there's a VAR? We cover football perhaps more than any other sport on this pod, and we watch that's sport perhaps more than the others. Now, would it be the equivalent of?
Interesting you say that, by the way, that we're watching a lot of football because Gianni Infantino this week told some ambassadors of countries in Qatar that his mission is to make football a truly global sport, because apparently it isn't global yet. But yeah.
Well, I don't know. Maybe we're in a minority who like and watch football, but no. But what I was wondering is this controversy, and Rob, you played a bit of tape there, and then there's some more as well. Would it be the equivalent of a penalty being awarded and a team manager calling the VAR room and saying this needs to happen? Because I found that would be intolerable pressure. So Michael Massey, the race director, he's able to be contacted by Christian Horner, the principal of Red Bull, and Toto Wolff, who we heard just there, to say, this is what you need to do and this is what must happen. That sounds outrageous. You're already under enormous pressure, season-defining decision, and you're getting the two principals, obviously with their own agendas clearly set, putting pressure on you. That can't be right, can it?
It's a bit like surrounding a fourth official on the touchline. But can you imagine, like Jose Mourinho would love to be in direct contact with the VAR room. One of the things that seems to be so confusing is just the application of the rules themselves, with suggestions that they were actually followed differently at a previous race in terms of what happens after a safety car. And I actually did ask Max Verstappen whether or not it's time for the rules to change when I spoke to him on a Zoom call from Abu Dhabi in the days after the race.
Do you think there's anything that can be done to make the rules clearer, or do you think the sort of chaos and confusion just adds to the drama and appeal? Or do you think actually everything can be made clearer so no one's sort of trying to work out what the stewards might do and how they should act?
There are always things to look at, of course, for sure. But that's always, after things like this, you're going to look into, what can we do? Or, what should have been done? This is with all kind of decision, isn't it? The same in football with the referee. Should it have been a penalty? Shouldn't it have been a penalty? What can we improve? Should we have had a different camera angle? All these kind of things you're gonna bring up for sure.
Verstappen was a bit hungover, I think, by his own admission when I spoke to him.
All the emotions they come out, so it was it was a lot of fun. Of course, when I woke up, that was not so fun. I regretted maybe that final drink, but yeah, no, it was very nice.
So what unfolded at the track in Abu Dhabi on Sunday was there was that initial Mercedes appeal that was rejected on 2 counts. But then their next option was to go to the FIA International Court of Appeal. And that was their final option, it seems. So the only bodies that could actually hear the appeals from Mercedes were FIA bodies. So it would be very hard to imagine that the sport's own governing body, its own officials, would overturn a result days after a race. There was that FIA statement talked about the misunderstandings and the reactions that currently tarnishing the image of the championship, as they said it, with no right, it seems, for Mercedes to go to the Court of Arbitration for Sport. So you can see why they gave up on the appeals process.
Yeah, incredible that you have a sport which doesn't have a access to the Court of Arbitration for Sport. I mean, that's the whole point of having that sort of supreme court for sport.
Yeah, I mean, this Mercedes probably right. The idea of the FIA marking its homework, marking itself down, and handing over a world championship for a mistake it made seemed very unlikely. And again, this is an issue of sports governance. We talk week after week about these governing bodies that were created decades ago that are no longer fit for purpose. And I think the FIA's current structure, probably its rule book as well, doesn't seem suited to what's happening, how the world works today. Again, there needs to be a separation of powers, maybe go to CAS. That said, you'll find a lot of people these days who follow the Court of Arbitration for Sport and believe that organisation doesn't work either, but it's probably the best of a bad situation, a best of a bad framework that sport has at the moment. and is, I suppose, inverted commas, independent compared to the FIA judging the FIA.
Do you think there should be an independent regulator for international sport? You love an independent regulator.
Well, Martyn, you know my views on that type of thing, and absolutely no, yeah, something independent, surely, away from the sport's own promoter. To be fair, Formula One is an independent company, and the FIA is supposed to be the independent governing body of that sport. But again, the crossover is too deep, it's too embedded. There has to be something outside of that the parties can trust. And obviously Mercedes and Toto Wolff did not trust that they would get a fair hearing if they carried on with this appeal. That said, they're one of the largest teams. They've not been complaining about the setup of the FIA until this moment. So, you know, if the shoe had been on the other foot, would Toto Wolff and Mercedes be complaining about the setup? I guess not.
There is a sort of leader of the opposition in sport. Bernie Ecclestone still lobbing barbs from afar this week, talking about the decisions being a joke. Then, strangely, still taking on Lewis Hamilton, who got knighted this week at Windsor Castle, suggesting he doesn't deserve it, saying it should go to people who've done something for the country. So, yeah, Bernie Ecclestone seems to be enjoying stirring things up and perhaps reveling.
Is he knighted? Is he Sir Bernie, Rob?
He's not. No, maybe that might be a sign of why he's so aggrieved at not getting the sword.
Yeah, but Bernie Ecclestone just now coming across as a sort of slightly bitter man. Yeah, not coming across as very pleasant.
F1 at least will be delighted to have managed to complete the season with just those few postponements due to the pandemic. And the fact is they're going into their off-season just as Omicron and the variant is causing so much concern across the rest of sports. So no F1 racing, at least until March, testing before then. But for now, it's particularly football that is bearing the brunt of the spike in coronavirus cases. And particularly, as we've seen in England and the Premier League, the fact is more games have been called off now in 1 week in the Premier League than in all of last season. And of course, last season dealt with the second wave of coronavirus cases in the winter and the variant that emerged from Kent and all those issues. In England, though, there are still full stadiums, unlike some other countries where we've seen some states in Germany, even a few weeks ago, start to reduce capacities and then completely close stadiums to fans, like at Bayern Munich. And there'll be a lot of anxious officials at the Premier League and clubs at the moment waiting to see how this unfolds in the coming days.
Yeah, I mean, situations varied across Europe, Holland, behind closed doors, England, Italy, Spain. Basically, we're still relying on sort of COVID passports as a vaccines or proof of negative tests, which, you know, from a commercial point of view, you can see why governments are very, very reluctant to sort of impose sort of lockdowns and zero capacities again. But yeah, it's a big crisis, and interestingly, in terms of the postponements, something that's contributing a lot to this is the number of unvaccinated players in the Premier League and the EFL. Something like a quarter of players, or possibly more, are unvaccinated and have no intention of getting vaccinated, and that's a big issue when it comes to isolation, because it's different for unvaccinated compared to vaccinated people.
And we did get the vaccination numbers from the EFL covering the 3 leagues below the Premier League this week. The fact is, 1 in 4 players don't want to get vaccinated at all. Only 2/3 are fully jabbed. Yet we know from Spain, more than 90% of players are fully vaccinated.
Love to know what's going on in those dressing rooms. You know, we kind of you wonder what messaging, who the charismatic figures are in the dressing rooms that are convincing some of their teammates at some of the clubs to not do it. And Martyn, you did mention this just now. There's a big difference between what vaccinated and unvaccinated players have to do if they are deemed to be a contact of a positive case. If you are vaccinated, you do not have to self-isolate, and if you're unvaccinated, you're you're pushed into isolation. If you've got, say, a quarter of a dressing room that's unvaccinated, that means a huge impact on whether you can fulfill your fixture list. I'm not, you can't force someone to take a vaccine. However, this seems quite unfair on teams that have vaccinated players and are going to have a fixture crush towards the end of the season and games postponed because of this. Guys, what do you think about that?
I think it's no coincidence that Manchester United have struggled, because we know that they are one of the clubs that have been struggling to persuade their squad to get vaccinated, whereas at other clubs like Leeds and Wolves, it's nearly 100%. So it's clearly a sort of dressing room thing, and so people spreading social media scare stories or stories they've heard by word of mouth. So it's a problem. I think we should point out, though, that 75%, 75% is similar to society. So in England, we're talking about that's about the same for 18 to 29-year-olds. But you could argue perhaps that at least the players have the benefit of top medical and scientific advice from people who can answer all their questions, including Jonathan Van Tam has done a call with players. So there's really no excuses.
He's done it more than once. But the other impact is this: it's a very small workforce. If you think about it, it's 24 people who would make up a squad. So unlike, we say at society at large 75%, that is quite right. But if you lose 25% of your workforce, and your workforce is only 24 people, that's a massive impact on the game. You've seen in other countries, I think there are specific rules in the NFL, the NBA. We talked about Kyrie Irving, who is unvaccinated, being left off his team in New York, a basketball player, as a result of his decision, because New York has the state has a mandate for players to be vaccinated, and they said, well, we're not going to take him on the road either, and that was a decision they took. I feel, however long if this pandemic is to endure, and it feels like it will, we're going to have some of these tough decisions in the Premier League and in football, perhaps at large.
And the NFL, like the Premier League, introducing new emergency measures this week. Both competitions mandating face masks are worn around team facilities, social distancing as well. What the NFL are saying is actually they want virtual meetings, and players shouldn't be eating together. They should just get grab and go meals, as it's being called, and also limiting the number of people in gyms and things like that as well. And in the Premier League, they're mandating those lateral flow tests before you're even allowed into the training ground. You have to get the negative results. And there at least has been some encouragement to get not only the vaccine, but the booster jabs from the likes of the Liverpool manager, Jurgen Klopp.
I know that all the anti-vaxxers out there will say, well, the Klopp said they were vaccinated, but now they got the virus. Yes. And that's exactly what everybody told before. It doesn't deny you getting or saves you from not getting it. You can get it, but you get through it properly in the right way. So that's how it is. That's what the vaccination is for. And yes, it makes it rather more unlikely to get it. But unfortunately, the boys had the booster too late for the infection now. So if they are infected, so that's the situation. I think really we should talk about it, because there's so many things out there in this case where we just don't understand. And it's not. How can you blame somebody who get the virus, and especially when he was vaccinated? There's no chance for. You can get it, so get through it and start from there.
It's not only Jurgen Klopp who's been endorsing vaccines in football this week. So has the UEFA president, Aleksander Ceferin, and UEFA are also going to be releasing a video with scientists backing the jabs for players.
I think that they should get vaccinated as soon as possible, but I still believe, for now, it's a personal choice. And we have to be smart. We have to explain things. People are not stupid. People understand when you explain in a nice way, not judging them, but to explain why vaccination is good.
UEFA President Aleksander Ceferin there. Something we're hearing from elements of European football, the European Club Association, some managers, calls against the African Cup of Nations, which is due to start in early January, and questioning whether players should even go, questioning their COVID-19 regulations where the players would be safe. Obviously, there's a desire from many clubs not to see their players go at all. They have insisted, the organisers of AFCON and officials in Cameroon, that the tournament will be going ahead. They've actually introduced new policies saying supporters can only enter stadiums if they're fully vaccinated and are able to show a negative PCR test result that's no older than 72 hours, or a negative antigen test no older than 24 hours, which seem pretty strict rules being put in place, particularly with lower vaccination numbers in somewhere like Cameroon and some parts of Africa where a lot of fans will be going from.
Yeah, the European Club Association have written a letter to FIFA saying that they reserve the right for their clubs not to send players both to the African Cup of Nations and to other internationals in January. I mean, I think there are reports in Africa saying that the tournament's under threat. So, and imagine if you're looking on a broader level, it may well be.
This letter from the ECA is reminiscent of the last international window, if you remember, in October, with South American qualifiers asking for extra release days in order to fulfill delayed, postponed qualifiers from earlier in the year because of COVID. They wanted 3 games, and they tried to essentially break the memorandum of understanding they had with the clubs in order to fulfill that. This is a fight, I feel, that is part of a broader issue of control over the calendar, which we've talked about. And they've alighted on the African Cup of Nations because this is another flashpoint. The teams, for instance, at AFCON, because of COVID, have been allowed to call up extra players. So larger squads, so more players will have to travel to Europe.
28
from Europe as
squad,
well.
bigger than the Euros even, which were 26 man squad.
Yeah, that's right. So much bigger. And they're writing to FIFA because rather than CAF, because for all respective purposes, one of the other things is FIFA is so embedded in Africa. A lot of people think that CAF, under its new president, and since Gianni Infantino sent a delegation with Fatma Samura to essentially normalize CAF a couple of years ago, controls African football. And you've got to kind of look at this beyond this sort of skirmish over this tournament, which is again, every time CAF and the African Nations tournament comes round, is a big fight because it's held in January, and we have this issue. It did get moved, funny enough, to the summer, but it was never staged in that moment because of environmental issues at one point, and then COVID. But then again, this is where the hand of FIFA again comes into this. It got moved back to January, I believe, as a fig leaf around COVID, etc. But again, Gianni Infantino wants that summer period clear as well, doesn't he? Because he's trying to promote new tournaments. So I often feel that African football is often like the hot potato in other people's fights. And it feels like, again, this is European football, European clubs, UEFA and FIFA, and there's CAF and its tournament. It's, been staged for decades around that period of time. Perhaps it needs to change, but the debate needs to be more open and transparent, like most in football.
I mean, it can seem disrespectful towards African football and believing from Europe that they have no right to hold the tournament and they're disrupting their leagues going ahead, whereas actually Africa has a full right to hold its continental championship. And the tone of some of the correspondents can be problematic, doubting they're going to have the protocols in place that are necessary, particularly when a country like the UK has one of the worst COVID rates in the world. Yes, it might be because there is more testing and it's bringing up more cases, but particularly from the UK perspective, even other parts of the continent, France and Germany, it's very hard to sort of suggest that, in this case, Cameroon can't get its house in order in terms of containing COVID-19 when it's so rampant in Europe.
Yeah, it feels Afrophobic in many points. And also, I think a lot of the players love playing in that tournament. You've seen Mohamed Salah win it with Egypt. It was a huge moment for him and for his country.
Is there a reason it couldn't be played in the June?
Yeah, it's too hot. That's
it's
one of the
not.
reasons why the AFCON is played in January, because of the temperatures quite high. Not maybe not in. I don't know the Cameroon case, but
depends
the idea of
depends which part of Africa.
yeah, but then you're asking Africa to keep moving its tournament round, to different times of the year. With the Euros, there'll be some really hot countries in, like Spain, in the summer's boiling. So if Spain get to host the Euros in say 2032, do we say, right, can we have it in January so it's a bit cooler in Spain? I mean,
No, I know, but what
maybe,
I'm saying is,
but that should be across the board.
January is very cold. June is very cold in South Africa, for example. It's winter, so it's not. You can't just say it's too hot.
It's great for football. Yeah, but it's great for football to play.
I know, but exactly.
In that weather. We went to the
it
World
should
Cup.
be in June. It should be in June then.
But I'm saying, if we're going to ask African countries to do this, we should be asking European countries to do the same, or other continents.
European countries do play in June.
No, but if it's too hot, I'm saying it's really hot in Spain, and like you try and play football in June and July in Seville, you're going to be melting, and that's what you could make the same case, can't you, if Spain were to get the Euros?
And that's because this week we have discovered new details about the bidding for the European Championship. We heard from UEFA the fact that there'll be a dual process for the Euro 2028 and Euro 2032. Obviously, at the same time, FIFA is still pushing ahead with plans for biennial World Cups. And we're talking about Spain because they're obviously a contender potentially for the 2030 World Cup. But could this be some sort of consolation, the way this process is working with UEFA as well, for a UK and Ireland bid as well, who they were looking at 2030 for the World Cup, but maybe they do prioritise 2032 now, given the support they have from UEFA, something reinforced this week when they decided that the match between the European champions and the South American champions, Italy and Argentina, the Finalissimo, will actually be staged on June the 1st in London, not Naples, as perhaps some might have thought, as a sort of tribute to Maradona, and could even be at Wembley, which was the scene of that disorder we talked about in the pod the other week at the Euro 2020 final. That will see England play a game behind closed doors in the Nations League, which will actually be against Italy, we now know, next July. But bidding is stepping up a pace, isn't it, for the Euros?
Yeah, this is clearly a strategy by UEFA to allow that, whether it's Britain or Ireland or Spain and Portugal who miss out on the World Cup bid, that they can get the Euros instead. But actually, it's not going to be quite that clear by the looks of it, because Italy had sort of been penciled in many people's minds for Euro 2028. But according to Gazzetta, the sports daily in Italy, they're much more likely to want to bid for 2032 now, because to give them more time to get their stadiums, which are generally in a pretty poor state, up to scratch. So that would see Euro 28 as the sort of so-called consolation prize. But we've already had indications from Russia and Turkey that they may bid for that tournament too. So it's not going to be quite as clear as it might have been.
No, and there's also this conversation. Rob, you mentioned the Finalissimo in London, but I think UEFA and CONMEBOL are also talking about other joint tournaments as well at the time. A kind of joint Nations League final, perhaps. Again, they're doing this, and these stories are leaking out a week before the FIFA summit next week, which is to discuss the biennial World Cup and other competitions. I think CONMEBOL and UEFA, who have sort of joined forces over the last couple of years to oppose pretty much anything that FIFA wants, are parking their tanks on the lawn and putting their marker down on the calendar ahead of whatever Gianni Infantino wants to propose. Whether there's going to be something beyond this competition between the winners of the Euros and the winners of the Copa America, we wait for that to be seen. But they are creating a joint strategy to have a larger international tournament, should they not like what FIFA proposes or what FIFA tries to push through.
UEFA and CONMEBOL were due to open their joint London office in the last couple of weeks, but those plans were called off due to COVID, but they are set to do so in the new year in London. And actually, there is a suggestion, something discussed in the UEFA Executive Committee meeting, that this will be the last purely all-European edition of the UEFA Nations League. The plan from 2024 potentially would see 22 teams playing in League A, and that's a rise from 16 currently, and 6 of them would come from South America, and 4 as well from South America would be placed into League B. So this would be a unified Europe, South America Nations League.
Where will those matches be played, Rob? Will they be travelling to home and away to South America, or will these games be in Europe? Because everyone's after a sustainable world these days. Is going to be more travel?
Well, that's unclear, although we are used to, in normal times, the likes of Brazil playing friendlies in London, and pretty meaningless friendlies often at times. Perhaps the crowds have diminished over the years. They're less as appealing and less of a sort of new element to them. And this might be one way of actually making those games more meaningful, although it would deny fans in South America the right to see their teams on home soil, some of their best players going back home to watch them in front of their own crowds, when a lot of them obviously are playing in Europe for their club teams.
You might as well go the whole hog and have a global Nations League, but obviously that's very political. But to go back to I like that tanks on the lawn metaphor, Tariq, because always reminds me of David Dean saying that about Roman Abramovich buying Chelsea, where he said that he's parked his tank on the lawn and it's firing 50 £50 notes. David Dean, who I understand this month has been in Qatar at the FIFA Arab Cup. And I'm sure he will be picking up intelligence about the likelihood of a British and Irish bid having a good chance of winning the World Cup bid or not.
One of the more pressing issues for UEFA this week has been that absolutely shambolic Champions League last 16 draw there that they had to redo. When we started the pod talking about the FAA and Formula One and grappling with their rule book and what to do, and the drawn out controversy over who won the title and what should have happened. Well, UEFA did act pretty swiftly to decide to redo that Champions League draw. It's normally such a smooth operation, if not drawn out, but a shambles, wasn't it, watching it unfold on Monday?
Absolutely pandemonium. But if you want to use the analogy we had with the Formula One, controversy sometimes is good, because social media was a buzz. Compared to previous draws, there was so much commentary, because it was the issue was to do really with Manchester United not being placed into the correct pot. They had decided that they could not play Atletico Madrid, I believe, and there was absolutely no reason for that. And the thing that struck me, if you know Giorgio Marchetti, the UEFA official who was presiding over the draw, he's an absolute nerd over calendars. He's a genius when it comes to this type of thing, and he prides himself on it. And this must have been killing him to have had this go so shambolically wrong. And they blamed a computer company that feeds them the data as to what pots, what alternative routes teams could play, because there's lots of things to consider, whether they've played each other before in the group stage and whether they're from the same nation. So there's kind of a lot of things to consider. But you know what? If it was, I bet you, in my mind, Giorgio could have done that without the computer, to be honest with you. So whoever this outside supplier was that UEFA was relying on, the one that it blamed for this shambles, I would hazard a guess to say that contract will be looked at for whatever termination clause there is in that, because it was a total mess. Eventually, they had an outcome, and it was quite funny. So the draw finished, instead of Manchester United playing Paris Saint-Germain, which would have been the standout tie of the last 16, ended up with Real Madrid facing Paris Saint-Germain, and that kind of made me think about those Super League days where Florentino Perez, the Real Madrid president, the ringmaster of that 48-hour episode, was up against, I suppose, Nasser Al Khalifi, the big winner of the Super League chaos. He emerged as the man who kept his team out of it, the big winner, now suddenly the chairman of the ECA. So we've got a kind of a Super League friend and foe derby to look forward to.
Just the type of heavyweight fixture that they wanted more often at Real Madrid, although now they're grumbling about why they ended up with PSG, a harder tie in the redrawn version. Maybe UEFA should sell an NFT of that original draw that was scrapped.
Yeah, beautiful irony on that.
Well, UEFA President Aleksander Ceferin did apologise for the debacle and says the processes are being looked at.
Objectively, it's UEFA's fault. Although it was software, we have to understand that it's us that are there. We shouldn't be so dependent on technology. We should. It's impossible to do it, I would say, or very hard to do it in a normal time frame without technology. But we should be less dependent on the technology, and we will inform the public soon about other measures. And of course, we are sorry that it happened, and we apologize to everyone. But as I said, mistakes happen.
Yeah, interesting. Ceferin saying they're going to be less dependent on technology in the future, which I presume is going to mean Giorgio Marchetti standing there with a piece of paper and saying, "Oh, yeah, Real Madrid are not able to play Manchester United." Yeah, I think it's too much technology can be a bad thing, as we've seen here.
Seen here with the draw, with the pod recording.
We've never had a snafu on this. It's a smooth operation, Rob.
Oh, absolutely. And many have thanked us over the months as we've got this sound quality even smoother. Incredibly, now at episode 47, so you'd expect we've got it sorted. Perhaps our production could be considered even as smooth as La Liga's TV output. And we now know this week they're going to be getting even more money coming in for those games. We know now how much they're banking from some of their domestic TV rights for the next 5 seasons. La Liga have clinched almost 5 billion euros from the sale of the subscription broadcast domestic rights. And not only does Movistar retain games, but not complete exclusivity this time, DAZN have come on the scene. They're getting 175 of the 380 matches. The first time a purely streaming service has picked up games for La Liga domestically, as still so many questions might linger about DAZN and their business model.
Yeah, a couple of interesting things with that La Liga TV deal. You mentioned it was 5 billion. It's the first time they were able to sell the rights for 5 years rather than 3. There was a law change in Spain that allows it to happen. It was, again, because of the pandemic. It means they can get the rights holders will have exclusivity for a longer period of time, and they managed to retain that price level. I think it went up slightly, but it largely flat. Probably good news as well, given that the wider environment around rights, the Premier League domestic rights. Martyn, the Premier League did a rollover, didn't they, in England?
Yeah, exactly the same amount of money with exactly the same broadcasters. Basically, that was authorised by the government, so they didn't actually have to go out to auction, which was a good deal for everyone involved, broadcasters and the Premier League alike. So, probably similar government manoeuvrings here in Spain.
Yeah, and the DAZN's entry seems significant as well. That this company is fascinating in the sense its business model and its strategy seems to be evolving and has been evolving since it emerged on the scene in around 2015. Back then, they were talking about picking up second-tier rights and being a complementary service. Since then, they have now moved into bidding for prime rights in domestic countries. So it had Serie A rights in Italy, for example, and now La Liga as well. Italy hasn't been without hiccups. The issue is the streaming quality, and the broadband service in Italy has been hit and miss, and they've had issues there. And then you talk about whether it's a sustainable model. The company, we're waiting for their latest set of accounts to be published, but for 2019, the most recent year, it lost £1 billion, and that's a huge amount of burn. And they presumably have to do that again and on a larger scale as they're picking up more and more expensive rights. And the thing that strikes me is they're in a marketplace where they're competing against very large companies that are able to offset these losses through bundling their sports rights with telephony, with larger cable programs, with broadband itself. DAZN is a one-stop sports shop. I'm really interested to see whether it can ever turn a profit.
Yeah, interestingly, DAZN had been heavily linked with buying BT Sport in the UK, the sports arm of BT. However, that now seems to have receded. So that would have looked like that they could have had a foothold there with the Premier League rights. That's now looking less likely, from what I understand.
One of the issues being around, I think, the sale of advertising as well, which is currently linked with Sky at the moment. One of the other things LaLiga is facing is still trying to get this complete resolution on the CVC investment. We've got Athletic Bilbao, Barcelona and Real Madrid opposing it amongst 5 clubs that rejected this gaining of 10% of the new joint commercial venture with La Liga. And they say they're taking this to the courts to resist it. They put forward their alternative plan, which they said was on better terms.
Yeah, this is another case, obviously involving Real Madrid as well, who are suing La Liga in about a dozen different ways at the moment. And yeah, they put forward an offer, a debt-based offer to the league for what they say are much better terms, 2.5%, which would have cost about 850 million euros to service over a 25-year term, as opposed to the billions that are likely to go to CVC as a result of the contract they've signed over 50 years. On the face of it, you could see the consternation for these teams, because often Real Madrid and Barcelona, it would be churlish to say they aren't the driving forces behind the La Liga's TV rights and its growth and revenue. You could see why they'd be opposed to this. The other aspect is the ones who've opposed this CVC deal are member-owned clubs. We mentioned Barca and Real, but Athletic Club de Bilbao as well. These are teams that don't have a proprietor and owner who can actually cash out quite handily with a certain alacrity once this money comes in. That I can't see this being more than a quick hit for some of these people who probably don't expect to own their clubs for decades or 50 years, as long as this CVC contract is going to last. Whereas, the member-owned clubs will have a different outlook on things.
I'll tell you what, if you were to be a sports business lawyer in Spain, you'd never be able to work, would you? I mean, it just seems the default position is go to court.
And you can rise to become La Liga president as a lawyer like Javier Tebas.
Oh, who'll get a 7-year contract with this new joint venture, by the way. We should be reminded of that, should it go through, and that's probably very handy for him.
Obviously, many seen there's a lot of value to be drawn out of football, and FIFA have focused on the women's game this week by actually unbundling the commercial rights between the men's and the women's game. We're seeing them linked together, how they sell sponsorships for World Cups, but they're finally going to actually focus on them separately, which actually could produce very different outcomes in terms of sponsors as well that are very focused on the women's game and promoting that, rather than actually having these bigger packages where inevitably they end up putting their resources heavily tilted towards the men's World Cup at the moment, I would say.
Yeah, it seemed like the right thing to do at the right time. They also unbundled the esports part of their business, which is growing pretty significantly. So you've got the 3 commercial structures now: men's football, women's football, and the computer game aspect of FIFA. You're right about women's football. There'd be a bunch of companies who would like to solely focus on growing area of women's football, and separating it out is smart in that sense. And they're also noticed, with 1 billion viewers for the last Women's World Cup, that the television rights as well are worth more than just chucking into the men's World Cup contracts, which is what's happened in the past. I think yeah, this is the time and this is the moment to do that, and they've like to see the results of this. It'll be very interesting.
Yeah, we've had a thing this week, haven't we, where Barclays have announced a £30 million sponsorship deal over 3 years for the Women's Super League in England. So it does show that commercially it's growing women's football. So I think it's a positive move.
Barclays doubling their investment from the current £15 million or so, and they're also going to get the title sponsorship of the Championship. And perhaps tellingly, they also did extend with the Men's Premier League at the same time. But actually, the more interesting headline was about the investment in women's football. And on the FIFA front, the Qatar World Cup ends in December 2022. The 2023 Women's World Cup begins in July. So it's a very short time frame for any sponsors to switch their focus from the men's to the women's World Cup, whereas already now you had purely women's World Cup dedicated sponsors. They're beginning to activate those campaigns too. Talking of Australia, which will be the next co-host of the Women's World Cup, some news of private equity investment in their domestic league, the A-League, which has actually been renamed this year, the Men's A-League and the Women's A-League.
Yeah, an interesting investment in Australian football. Silver Lake, the company which owns a big chunk of Manchester City, have paid $100 million to buy 1/3 of the Australian Professional League, which oversees the major men's and women's clubs. And as part of this, we have Simon Pearce, who's a Manchester City director, who's vice chairman of its Melbourne club. He's also going to be, or is on the board of the Australian professional leagues. So that this sort of City football group tentacles are spreading very, very widely into Australian football.
Simon Pearce also part of the government in Abu Dhabi on the Executive Affairs Authority. So very connected there with the state. And also in Abu Dhabi this week is actually the World Swimming Championships for 25 metres. And Martyn, in your must-read Saturday sports notebook in the Times, you've got some news from the world of swimming and transgender athletes.
Yeah, interesting case here. You've probably heard there's been a bit of controversy in the United States about Leah Thomas, who's a transgender swimmer who's won lots of college races in swimming, and her time has been like so amazing that there's even suggestions she could beat the record set by Katie Ledecky. But obviously, there's always controversy around this because there are lots of people, including swimming coaches, who think it's unfair that she's competing in women's competition because she originally was a man and has had the benefits of going through puberty as a male and stuff. Now, FINA, swimming's world governing body, from what I understand, are this is almost like the biggest test of the new president Hussein al-Musalam's time, and he's only recently been elected, and he's facing this really serious sort of challenges how they handle this, because the IOC have effectively passed the buck to the sports. The IOC is saying you don't need to reduce testosterone levels as far as they are concerned. So from FINA is now going to appoint a special expert panel made up of medical, scientific, and ethical experts who are going to come up with a policy in deciding should transgender women be allowed to compete against women on just normal? Should they have to take testosterone reduction drugs, or should they actually not be able to be permitted to compete at all? It's a very, very thorny moral and ethical issue.
Absolutely. I heard someone we've had on this pod before, Ross Tucker, talking about this on his Science of Sport podcast. And the question of testosterone reduction, he seems to just won't really make a difference here because the gains are already there. In this, you've already benefited from that testosterone you've had. And he pointed out, and perhaps it's the same in this case, and it gets to the heart of the issue, is inclusion versus fairness. And, there are female-born swimmers who have complained about this. It's just like you said. It feels like someone's going to lose. Someone is going to lose out here. There is no perfect answer, and it just depends on which one of those aspects that you think, or a sports governing body will think is more important than the other. Is it fairness or is it inclusion? I just think it's one of those issues that you're never going to get to the right answer that's going to please everyone.
I mean, last week we had David Gravenberg, the former chief executive of the Commonwealth Games Federation, who's now head of the Centre for Sport and Human Rights, suggesting that you could include transgender athletes by perhaps having staggered starts for races, which to me seems the least satisfactory solution to the whole issue.
And you can always check more on this topic by going back to our podcast from June, episode 24, when we spoke to Kristen Worley, the transgender cyclist, and indeed Ross Tucker, the South African sports scientist. And that brings a close to this week's episode of Sport Unlocked. From myself, Rob Harris, and Martyn Ziegler and Tariq Panja. Keep well, stay safe, everyone. Enjoy the sports viewing in the days ahead. And if you've got any feedback, you can always message us at Sport Unlocked on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. But for now, thank you for listening. Goodbye.